right up behind him, so he was up in the ticket he got. Wheelchair person, the aid to a wheelchair person is what his ticket is going to be. I've been to what they call it level. Sally and I, we got tickets one time for Friday afternoon game. We were underneath that. We started red lights on. I'm doing all right.
There we go. That's more like it. Well, good morning. We are going to continue our study in Deuteronomy this morning. We're in the 15th chapter, and we're going to start with verses 10 and 11. It's pretty much a continuation of what we started last week that started at about verse 7, and it was talking about how you handle the poor. And God's law tells the children of Israel that it's so important to be open-hearted to the poor, especially among your brethren. Verse 7, as a matter of fact, just kind of reviewing, said that if there is among you a poor man of your brethren within any of the gates in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your poor Jewish brother, your children of Israel brother. Well, what does verse 8 say? It says, open your heart to your poor brother. Open your heart and your hand wide to him, and willingly lend him sufficient for his need whenever he needs. Provide what he needs. Take from what you have been blessed of and give to him. Then verse 9 warns, of course, beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of release, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you shall give him nothing, and he cry out to the Lord against you, and it becomes sin among you. Of course, what this verse is talking about, what we discussed last week, that the seventh year, every 7 years, was a year of debt forgiveness. And verse 9 is telling these Jewish that are more wealthy than others and who can help their poor brethren, just because you're near the seventh year, this year of debt forgiveness, don't close your heart to them. Don't close your wallet to them. When they have need, help their need. Don't look at the calendar and think, well, that's a good time to help them. But no, this is not a good time to help them. Help them whenever. And verse 9 is quite insistent on that. And now, when we get into verse 10 and 11, we're going to continue the thoughts that we have just kind of reviewed. Before we get into our study this morning, let's bow and have a word of prayer. And Brother Keith, would you pray for us, please? We continue the thoughts through verses 10 and 11. And verse 10 says, you shall surely give to him, and your heart should not be grieved when you give to him. Because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works, and in all to which you put your hand. For the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to your poor and your needy in your land. Well, this couldn't be clearer. Those continuing words, and what he's telling these of the children of Israel, don't just help the poor because it's the rules. He's asking them to help, to assist from the heart. Help from the heart. Open your heart. Benefit your brethren. Want to help. Look for opportunities to help your poor brethren. And have a good attitude. Don't begrudge anybody, and don't go into it and think, oh, I guess I'm going to help these people again. They're having a tough time again. No. Moses' words from God, look for opportunities to help. Gladly, with joy, help your brothers and sisters of the children of Israel. Give freely. And don't be selfish. I think that's probably the key to it all. When you're helping your Jewish brethren, do not be selfish. Don't hold back. But whatever their needs are, you take care of their needs. And why does he say that? Because there's not going to be any kind of a situation where everyone's just going to be wealthy and not going to need any help. He tells them in verse 11 that there always would be poor people among the children of Israel. There would always be people who would need assistance, some who are blessed more or less than others for whatever reason. There would be these poor people. And of course, all of them would be poor eventually, because of their disobedience. As the land would slide back, would lose its love for Jehovah. Jehovah would not only put them in situations where they would lose their land, but God would impoverish them, and he would impoverish all of them. Eventually, they'd have nowhere to go because of their disobedience, their lack of faith in Almighty God. They knew that if they didn't obey him, they would be poor. We already studied that in this chapter. Verse 4, we go back to it. He says, except when there may be no poor among you, for the Lord will greatly bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance. But only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord your God. In verse 5, observing with care all the commandments which I command you today. They will be blessed, and they can bless others as long as they are faithful. When they disobey, when they lose their faith, things are going to go in the other direction. But the people who suffer are not always the people who've done wrong things. As we mentioned, some are more blessed than others, and that's why he says that there will always be these poor among you. So be generous to your poor Israelite brethren. That's the command. Help them in any way they need, not just in the manner of money. Give them a home if they need a home. Give them a bed. Give them food, obviously. Give them clothing. Tend to your poor brethren's needs. And the generous person certainly will not lose because he gives freely. We go back to 2 Corinthians 9:7, and Paul talks about generous people, generous toward the church, generous towards others, and he basically, if you put it in a nutshell, says you will not lose if you show love and you give willingly. And the Lord's going to bless you, and he was going to bless these people and everything that they did, as long as they showed this spirit of generosity that is called for in these verses. Verse 12, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free among you. Go free from you. We're getting into the area here, and it takes care of the rest of this chapter, the area of servitude, servanthood, slavery. These are all pretty much covered in these verses. And
in those days, it wasn't the same slavery I think we had here.
No. This is pretty much a debt thing. You're right. They basically sold themselves to service. And as this verse talks about, it's a 7-year or a 6-year term that you would serve someone in that capacity. But the 7th year comes, it's saying that they should be freed. It's an indentured servitude. It's kind of like a lot of people who, when the America was settled by Europeans, a lot of people didn't have the money to pay for the passage to come on the ships, but they wanted to come here. Very much in the 17th and the 18th century. So what did they do? Well, they offered their services over an amount of time. If you'd pay my way, you buy my ticket, and I'll work for you, and they would agree on an amount of time to repay the cost of the ticket. And this is pretty similar. Pretty similar, except it's probably a little longer period of time. But when an Israelite had become very poor, he could sell himself to another Israelite as a slave, or as we mentioned, an indentured servant. And the person that bought him pretty much is told here to still consider this person a brother and not as a slave to be mistreated like they were in Egypt. Treat him as a brother. Treat him basically as an employee.
Wasn't the 7 year, wasn't it a set period though, meaning
Yeah.
Meaning like if I would become an indentured servant in 2021.
In 2022 is the year.
Yeah, that's right. That's why he was talking about previous verses that, just if somebody waits until that 6th year and 11th month and 28th day, don't neglect them or whatever.
Exactly. I don't think, I don't really see that it's the same thing here. From my studies, it looks like that you're on the clock. That you obligate yourself to someone, you're on the clock. And
I get indentured in 2021 and you get it in 2022, you're 7 years.
2028 or 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like that was what that seemed to be was a maximum. Now, it doesn't necessarily say, well, every time that an arrangement like this is made, you have to do it for 6 years. It could be a shorter amount of time, again, depending on the debt that had to be retired or taking care of the need. As we mentioned, a lot of poor people just said, I just need to hire myself out so I can have something to live on. And they could do that, but it would be 6 years, and the 7th year they would be freed. But they should be considered as not a slave and mistreated. Leviticus 25:39 says that they should be considered as a brotherly hired servant. And using that term, there's a little bit better treatment that is involved here. The hired servant would be much better, certainly title-wise, than a slave, would be treated better than a slave. And so that these 6 years would not be tedious, would not be oppressive, unless you run into someone who misuses this relationship. And then the 7th year comes, if they are obligated to 6 years, and this hired servant must go free. Now, as we mentioned, and I do have them on my notes, Kevin, the rule that they must cancel the debt every 7th year did not include the freedom of these people. The slave must go out throughout the area of the deal of the sale for 6 years. We know, though, back in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 40 and 41, there was an exception. God does provide at times exceptions to the rules, especially when he was providing the law to the children of Israel. And this is one that we could look at that. Back in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 40 and 41, it reads, as a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. This is every 50 years. And as a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you until this year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. So this year of Jubilee provided a year of relief. And that could end this 6 year to 7 year term that we've been talking about. Perhaps an Israelite was single when he became a slave to his master, then he would go free as a single person. Another Israelite comes and is married. When he comes to this hired servant status, that man would go free with his wife. However, if the master provided a wife for the slave, we're going to look at this a little bit more. The wife and any children would not go with him. Again, if this was a match made and a wife provided by the master. All these different circumstances are quite interesting. They belong to the master. We can look back to Exodus chapter 21, and we see the circumstance here. Exodus 21, verses 2 through 4. And reads like this: If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. There's the word that we're just talking about. Probably a good master would not impose this restriction. The good master, the wise master, would see if a family's been established, it's not good for the family to be split apart. That's where you have a faithful man, a good man as a master who will not mistreat those who work for him, who's a good boss.
They're considered part of his house.
They're part of his house. And he has these decisions he can make on their relationships. But certainly the law gives him the right to keep this wife and children away from the freed man in this relationship because of what he has provided as far as his end of the bargain. Any other thoughts on those verses? Let's look at verses 13 and 14, and they read, "And when you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress, from what the Lord your God has blessed you with, you shall give to him." So a master frees a slave. He doesn't walk away empty-handed. I hate to use the analogy. It almost reminds me of a guy leaving prison. They give him $5 in that cheap suit. I've watched too many 30s gangster movies, you know.
That's what they did. I mean, when Papa ran the prison for them, they made like $2 a month.
Yeah.
And 50 cents out of that $2 to buy their clothes when they left.
Now, in this case, it sounds to me like when this slave is released, and he basically is almost being given a steak, what they used to call a grub steak, but back in the old West days. I mean, you're being given food in the form of wheat from the threshing floor. You're being given wine from the wine press, and you're being given from the flocks. You're being given animals. You're being given things where you can start a new life. And certainly you're given flocks. That's food. That's also an ability to start a trade as a one who tends cattle. And
It's basically just like one of his children,
it is almost like one of your children. That's a good point. You're given a future here. And the master must be generous. And of course, the slave was basically, during his 6 year or however long period everything was going to the master. He was working for the master. He wasn't necessarily saving things for himself. He needs help for a start. And these verses are saying that it's up to this master to provide a generous start to this slave. Now, there was no rule as to how much a master must give to the slave. He just says that he should be generous and he should provide the basics as this slave leaves. And certainly if he's taking a wife and children with him, even more. They need even more to provide for themselves.
There, once again, you need to look at the children of Israel when they left Egypt, how they plundered and got all the gold
Yep.
and stuff from them. They were slaves in Egypt. They come out there
Yeah.
rich.
They left rich people. You're right. They left wealthy. And this isn't necessarily saying that you should make your slave wealthy, but you should provide him what he needs to go on and to start a new life, because after serving for 6-7 years as a slave, you're freeing this person. It's a whole new existence, a whole new way of life. You're walking away, unless you don't walk away. And of course, we'll study that here in these next verses here, because some did not necessarily want to wait. But the master has been well blessed by the Lord, and it's up to the master to use those blessings to give to the slave, although it's up to his discretion on how he will benefit the slave, because the master is giving to the slave things to help him to provide for the future. As we mentioned, it's animals, it's grain, it's wine, bread, things that the basics of life are being given here. Now, the words that are translated as being generous, they include another idea as well. Think about this. They include the idea of giving honor, because this man's not a slave anymore. The wife's not a slave anymore. The children aren't slaves anymore. We might say that they're restored to regular society. They're independent. They're independent operators now. And they're worthy of as much honor now as the master. And they need to be restored as a full member of the society there among the children of Israel. What the master gives them will enable them to reach that area of restoration. It's so important that they be given a start. And what's being described here and what's being commanded here is giving these individuals a new start. Verse 15, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. Oh, let's go back to Egypt. God was not going to let them forget where their ancestors came from. None of those people are alive now. Save Moses, save Aaron, save Joshua. But they needed to be reminded. And in verse 15, he tells it once again. You were slaves in Egypt. You were the lowest of the low. The Lord freed you when you left Egypt, and you came out and filled up with lots of wealth. You were rich. You were taking the spoils of Egypt with you as you traveled. The Egyptians, of course, gave you gold and silver and clothing. There were animals that were given. God loved the Israelites, and he had freed them. He made them wealthy. He gave plenteous provisions for them. Because of that, you be as generous to your poor brethren, to your formerly enslaved brethren, as I was generous to you. God is reminding them, you've been more than blessed by me, because you had nothing when you left Egypt. This nation left Egypt and crossed the sea, dry land, and began driving toward a new life, a new existence. You had nothing. I gave it to you, and I gave you freedom. When you give freedom to your higher servant, you be just as generous, and you be just as much a blesser as I bless. For you, as mentioned, these masters were too young to manage each. They were latter generation, but they belonged to the nation. As long as they were part of Israel, they were part of that legacy of God, freeing them, blessing them, enriching them, and protecting them. It's almost as if they had been slaves to them because their ancestors were. The legacy continued. The reach of that legacy went on to these further generations, and they must not forget it, and they must not allow it to harm themselves as they work with others, as they hire others to work for them. Moses is telling them, you've got to be the better people. You've got to be the more blessed people because of what God has given you, and what God is blessing you is about to bless you with all this new land across the Jordan River. Be the bigger people. Be the better people. And shine out among those, especially when you cross the Jordan, and we take out all these heathen people, these idol worshippers. You be the better people. And you shine as a light and example of the blessings of Almighty God. Verse 16. I don't want to go away from you because he loves you, and your house since he prospers with you. Now we have the higher servant that decides, well, I want to stay. It pretty much handles the rest of the chapter. So this Jewish slave may not want to leave his master at the end of the 6 years. There might be several good reasons for this decision. He may love his master, may love his master's family. There's a good relationship that has developed over this amount of time. He enjoyed the time he worked for his family, and he wanted the arrangement to simply continue. Let's not cut it off. Let's continue this situation. And these verses are providing for that relationship to go on. Maybe this hired servant had married into the master's, his master's employment. Could have been married to the master's family. Could have taken a daughter, for instance. And he may choose to remain there for the love of his wife and children. That was discussed as well as we just previously read back in Exodus 21. And maybe he really also, and this might be a little bit of a gray area, but maybe he just still didn't want to be responsible for his own future. He was depending on the responsibility of the master. And if he was leaving, he'd be responsible for his own. Maybe he didn't feel he was able to be responsible for his own future. And perhaps he would believe that he could manage things on his own. But as long as he stays with the master, he knows that he's in a safe place, that he's unfed, he's being provided a home in exchange for work. And of course, if it's an older slave, he looks at his future, he may know that at these ages, that of course things slow down. I have physical issues that he knows he has to go out and take care of things on his own. He may not be able to do the things he needs to survive. Another possible situation like one would want to remain with that master even though his time of freedom has come. Now, there would have been occasions when the master may have not wanted to keep a slave, but that was his decision. He says, I don't need you anymore. I can't afford to keep you anymore. So there's 2 ways through here. But in this passage, though, there's no rule that allows this master to refuse this slave. This basically is all about the slave. And basically, the fact that he wants to continue the relationship really doesn't say the master to say no. It's pretty clear. Verse 17. Then you shall take them all and thrust it through his ear to the door of hurt. And he shall be your servant forever, or he shall be your servant forever. Also to your female servant, you shall do likewise. There's a lot. Exactly. It was just Israel that did that. It was all of those in that area would use this all in this idea of basically creating almost like a earring pierce to do that. And it had a long history. Starts from Africa right now, but I'll be surprised that it's not still deeper into the tribal areas you go. You might see that. And so the slave does not want to leave his master. And his master will consider the situation. You go back to Exodus 21, I see that it's kind of possible. It's in verse 6. Let's read what these words say regarding this situation. Verse 6, chapter 21 of Exodus says that his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever.
see that there had to be almost like a ceremony, bringing to the elders, bringing almost to say this is officially what's going to happen in this case. This person wants to be a servant of mine throughout the rest of his life. So they're bringing. Yeah, remains the neighborhood. The belong to the master until their servitude ends. That's that choice. That's why maybe it's only next door, down the street, down the road. Because that'd be a tough choice to make. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I would think that would be the case. I think that would clearly be the case. He's not necessarily obligated to, but the master would. I think you're right. So, yes. That's true. So, we're talking about this servant that wants to stay. And everyone in the community knows, well, I didn't move in God's law. I'm not released this man in the 7th year. The servant wants to stay. Why are we saying that? It's, well, this is common knowledge now. So now there's an indication, a physical indication that this person wanted to stay. So those of you may not understand what is an AWOL, well, it is a sharp piece of metal. It's a piercing piece of metal. And you would take the sharp metal and you would run it into probably the earlobe of the slave. And the slave is standing at a door. They're almost like for using a door space to run this all through. It's a very good, it says to feel like it would be a very pleasant operation. It's almost like some people today when they get tattooed, that's their choice. But it's not necessarily a painless operation. We know this is certainly not painless. I mean, you're making a physical change to one's body and running this all through the earlobe. And the fact that it's being done in the community and even in the spiritual community, that it's actually been done in an area of worship around the altar. But it definitely meant he would probably do it around the master's house. So the slave, when this ceremony takes place, would be a servant to the master for the rest of his or her life. However, in the special 50th year, this Jubilee year, once again, this master must free the slave. That's the command, apparently, that all slaves were covered by this. And the slave's family would then receive their original property among the children of Israel. So this exception covers these people, even though they have the mark of being a lifetime servant. The last verse in this thought is chapter verse 18. That's pretty much we are last for today. The verse 18 says, "It shall not seem hard to you when you send him away free from you, for he has been worth a double higher servant. It's serving you 6 years, and the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do." So the master of the good slave may not want to see this slave go after 6 years, but he must free the slave unless the slave has decided to stay, and we go through the ceremony that we've just described. And this is telling the master, you be grateful for the service that this slave, this hired servant has given you over the 6 years. Don't just look at him as a piece of trash that was doing your bidding, but it was a blessing blessing to you that this good servant worked for you and benefited you, probably enriched you through his work or her work. And don't think about what you won't have in the future. God obviously wants to say, make it happen. But the good master promised blessing by God. In the last phrase here, the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. You good servants. That should be the incentive to treat people well. Because God has blessed you with their servants. He's enriched you through their service. You have grown in wealth and prestige. And you remain faithful and good to those who work for you. You be a good boss. And that goes for today. You be a good boss. And you're going to be blessed of the Lord. Your work is going to be blessed of the Lord. And that's what would happen to these people when they freed their slave. You're still going to be blessed. Maybe others will come along to replace this one who has worked as a servant for 4, 5, 6 years, 7 years, or whatever. But you did be a good boss. You're going to be blessed. You're at will. We will finish the chapter again in chapter 16. Next 4 we'll start with verse 19. Thanks for your attention.